Celiac dietitian here with over 10 years lived experience with celiac myself, and I want to talk about the pervasive myth that also has been alive at least since the dawn of my diagnosis over 10 years ago, which is that the people in the United States can tolerate the gluten in Europe. So I want to talk about some of the things that debunk this myth and also talk about where this myth might have started from. And we'll start with, I've got a lovely piece of information up on my screen here that I'm going to share with you. We'll start with talking about the gluten content in different forms of wheat. So before we get into this though, I do just want to emphasize, if you have celiac disease, you have an official celiac diagnosis, you cannot eat gluten regardless of where it comes from, whether it comes from pesticide-covered fields in the United States or completely organic artisanal fields in the countryside of Italy. It does not matter where the gluten is from. You cannot eat it if you have an official celiac diagnosis. But I do want to touch on why I think this myth exists and some things that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this and trying to think of, like, why would this even be a myth that is here. So pulling up on my screen, I have this web page from Iowa State University. It's just what I found that I think clearly breaks down like the different gluten contents between the different types of wheat. Something that is suggested is that in the United States, we produce more hard wheats, and in Europe, they produce more soft wheats. This is what suggests that I can't find like official information on this. That's just what I've read, what I've seen other scientists present. And if you look at soft versus hard wheats, softer wheats tend to have less gluten, about 8%, 8 to 11%, and harder wheats tend to have more gluten, around 11 to 12%. So in this case, that could be why right off the bat, people feel like they can tolerate the gluten in Europe, but not in the United States, because potentially in Europe they are using more softer wheats, which would have a slightly lower gluten content compared to the United States, where they may be using a harder wheat, which may have a slightly higher amount of gluten. Now remember, if you have celiac disease, you cannot have gluten regardless of the percentage or whatever. Like, all of this is off the table for you. But if you have a gluten intolerance or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is completely separate from celiac disease, you might find you tolerate it better because there's a lower amount of gluten. And again, please, there's so many differences between gluten intolerance, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and celiac disease. It's so important we keep those separate because the treatment looks very different, the outcomes look very different, everything looks so different. But if you have celiac disease, you can't tolerate it regardless. I don't care if you feel like you have symptoms or not. Just because you don't have symptoms doesn't mean harm's not being done. If you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance, it could explain why you might find when you go to Europe, you can tolerate it. And I think because there's such this confusion between celiac disease and gluten intolerance, people can confuse that maybe they actually have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. They don't have an official celiac diagnosis, and they go over there and they're like, oh, I can tolerate the gluten. And then because people aren't differentiating the two conditions, they assume that means everyone who's gluten-free can have the gluten in Europe, which is just not the case. So I suspect that part of this myth, where people with celiac disease can have the gluten in Europe, may stem from the fact that Europe might be producing softer wheats which have a slightly lower percentage of proteins in them compared to the United States. But that's not the only thing. There are other things that are happening. There's also like a pesticide argument, and we use specific pesticides in the United States that Europe might not use. But here's where all of these claims kind of fall flat, which is people in Europe and actually globally all develop celiac disease. It's not just a United States issue. Celiac disease is a global, like a worldwide recognized condition that develops in many different countries across the globe. People in Europe also have celiac disease. They cannot consume gluten. They can't eat their own gluten. They can't eat our gluten. They can't eat any gluten. And so that's where that pesticide argument falls off the table. Additionally, I want to say too, with celiac disease and people suggesting maybe people with celiac can tolerate the gluten in Europe. There's like almost like this I suppose, like, I can't address this without acknowledging too, there may be a placebo effect here. So with all of this negative information we have about food in the United States and this idealization of European foods, and you come from the United States and you go to Europe and you eat gluten and you have this idea that their food is so much better, you have this idea that you're going to be able to tolerate the gluten, a placebo effect could be there in why people say they feel completely fine when they're eating the gluten in Europe. I don't know how many times I'm going to say this in this video, but I'm saying it a lot. If you have celiac disease, again, I don't care how you feel after you eat gluten, you should not eat it if you have an official diagnosis, because just because you don't have symptoms or you don't notice symptoms, it doesn't mean it's not doing damage. But this could be a potential explanation as to why. Now, I'm going to talk to people who don't have a official celiac diagnosis for a minute, because I do also want to acknowledge something that is a little bit more nuanced that they might want to explore if they're trying to figure out what's going on. Why can they tolerate the gluten in Europe? So first, also to clarify, people with celiac can't eat sourdough. That's another myth that is often pervasive, and I do have a video up about that if you want to check it out, explaining the research on that and the misinformation around that and where that comes from. But if you are someone who does not have celiac disease, but you do find you're reacting to gluten and you go to Europe and you're eating sourdough bread, you're eating breads that are, or pastries that are likely fermented, the fermentation process can break down sometimes in cases it can break down gluten, not to any level that is safe for celiac, so celiac, stay away from this part of the conversation, but also what's known as fructans. They're a FODMAP, and you might not actually be reacting to gluten, but you're reacting to fructans, which is found in wheat, and maybe you feel better eating the products in Europe because more often they are fermented than in the United States, and so you feel like you tolerate them better, and potentially you may want to have a conversation with a FODMAP aware provider about whether or not this is an issue with gluten and or FODMAP, specifically fructan. So I just want to touch on that. Please do not try to DIY that. FODMAPs are a very complicated situation. You want to make sure you're working with a appropriately informed provider on that. You can do a lot of harm and a lot of damage to your body if you try to DIY the FODMAP situation and you do it wrong. And I've seen it happen so many times. Please, like, if there's anything you take from this, I cannot emphasize enough, don't eat gluten if you have celiac, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of if you have symptoms, and do not try to DIY a FODMAP scenario, because that can be so harmful, so damaging. It can really mess up your gut. Okay. So those are some things to consider. Gathering our thoughts, we found out that there are some slight differences between the types of wheat that are potentially mainly grown in the United States versus mainly grown in Europe. But regardless, celiac disease occurs globally. It occurs in Europe, it occurs in America. It's not like the people in Europe just don't develop celiac and can always eat gluten. They develop celiac too, and they can eat gluten. In fact, some of the highest prevalencies of celiac disease are in European countries like Italy, like Scandinavia. So in that, if you have celiac disease, that myth is completely dispelled. You cannot eat the gluten there, and I suspect that potentially this is coming from people potentially confusing gluten intolerance, non-celiac gluten sensitivity with celiac disease, assuming that anyone who lives gluten-free is going to have the same experience and be following the same treatment protocol, and thus, because people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity and gluten intolerance sometimes can tolerate the gluten there, that means that that is the same for people with celiac. There could be a placebo effect here, and what I also didn't mention is if you're traveling to Europe, there are a lot of other things that could be at play too during travels that are changing your routine, that could potentially be improving digestion or worsening it. It just depends. And that could also be at play as to why you feel better, why you feel like you're not getting so sick, and you could be attributing it to food when it could be something else, like you're getting more sleep, you're able to catch up on sleep, you are eating more routinely, you're eating more, and you're eating enough finally. Maybe you weren't eating enough when you were in America. Maybe you have more time to slow down. That is a huge part of European culture, is to slow things down a bit more, and that's really soothing to your body. It's giving it enough time to properly digest and properly function. Maybe you're able to actually relax because you've been so stressed in the United States working and all of that. You're on vacation in Europe and you're able to relax, you're able to enjoy yourself, you're able to laugh and connect with the people you're traveling with. There's a lot going on there that could be at play, and it might not even be food that's happening, so you also want to consider that as well. So, wrapping up, people with celiac can never eat gluten regardless of where it comes from, regardless of if they feel like they are reacting or not, or they're noticing symptoms or not. That's like end all be all. You cannot eat it. Don't do it. If you have gluten intolerance or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, maybe you can tolerate the gluten a little bit better in Europe for a lot of different reasons. If you are suspecting other potential causes, please work with your provider. But because people often confuse these two conditions to be the same and the treatments to be the same, I also suspect that maybe this myth is coming from that confusion and coming from the fact that people fail to differentiate those two things. And then finally, there are other things at play when you're vacationing that could potentially be causing the situation, and we can't discount the placebo effect. But point blank, if you have celiac, you cannot eat the gluten. I don't care where it comes from. All of that said, if you found this helpful, if you found this discussion helpful, you've been wondering like, where is this myth coming from, and you like the discussion around what's going on there, go ahead and hit that like button. If you want more information brought to you from a celiac specialized registered dietitian and also fellow celiac of 10 plus years, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you need any celiac safety resources, check out the description box down below. I have resources ranging from free to paid, so you can definitely check those out. And all of that said, my name is Taylor Silverduke, registered dietitian specializing in celiac, and I will see you when I see you.